This is a story about one of the most marvelous and complicated phenomena in an extremely marvelous and complicated place. This is a story about disagreements, a story about misunderstandings, a story about subjective opinions clashing against objective truths. This is a story about life. Imagine a young, yellow star in a tumultuous and turbulent solar system. 92 million miles away is orbiting a sphere of molten iron, slowly cooling down and accumulating water from the celestial buffet surrounding it. Eventually, the ball of iron had cooled down enough and taken enough water onto its surface that pools of liquid water could condense out of the atmosphere and settle on the ground. There's a magical molecule, you may have heard of it, called RNA. You see, a long time ago, in one of these pools of liquid water on the surface of the Earth, the individual nucleotides of RNA naturally formed and floated freely in the pool. The nucleotides came together via electromagnetism to form single strands of RNA. The end of each nucleotide was sticky and attracted a certain complementary nucleotide. All 4 nucleotides were freely floating in the pool, so it was easy for each strand to attract a complementary strand of RNA opposite its own nucleotides. During the nighttime, when it was cold in the water, the 2 opposite strands stuck together, but when the sun came and the water heated, the nucleotides were no longer strong enough to hold the 2 opposite strands together. All over this pool on the surface of the Earth, RNA is replicating itself and creating complementary strands of RNA. Now, once in a while, another rogue nucleotide is able to slip itself into a strand where it doesn't quite belong, and a slightly modified strand of RNA is born. And this new strand may have chemical properties which make it either more or less adept at surviving and replicating in its environment. Now, if you've been paying attention, you've probably realized that I've just described the abiogenesis of life on Earth. You've probably realized that over millions and then eventually billions of years, those RNA strands kept replicating and got more complex, developing larger structures and new strategies to survive and reproduce more efficiently. At some point came the cell, then the mitochondria, then multicellular organisms, etc. ad infinitum et pluribus unum. Now here's a question. Were those self-replicating strands of RNA alive? They didn't have cells or DNA, they don't eat anything or make energy. Maybe they're just a neat coincidence of chemistry. Regardless of your opinion on the status of RNA molecules, that chemical system of self-replicating RNA eventually led to the Earth with all its inhabitants. Plants, animals, bacteria, and more are all descended from those chemical experiments in the early Earth. Currently, the planet is covered with a pernicious species of primate called Homo sapiens, which roughly translates to wise man. They named themselves, if you couldn't already tell. Moving on. These creatures are somewhat intelligent enough to look at the world around them and ask some basic questions. They're smart enough to notice an inherent difference between things like birds and things like rocks. They call things like birds in themselves alive, and things like rocks not alive. The human definition of life is that 1. Living things are made up of units called cells. 2. Living things reproduce. 3. Living things are based on a universal genetic code. 4. Living things grow and develop. 5. Living things obtain and use materials and energy. 6. Living things respond to their environment. 7. Living things maintain a stable internal environment. And 8. Taken as a group, living things change over time. According to the textbook definition, RNA molecules definitely aren't alive. They don't have cells. They don't really grow and develop. In order to understand this issue, we need to take a step back and get a larger perspective. Picture this. Imagine that on some distant planet orbiting some distant star, a similar coincidence of chemistry occurs which creates self-replicating molecules. It doesn't really matter what it is or how it happened, but regardless, the complexity of these molecules increased, and a few billion years later, we have a planet teeming with life. A new form of life arises on the planet. We'll call them the hivists for the sake of the story. Each individual organism of the hivist species is much like an ant in an ant's colony. Each individual is just a simple organism that can move, sense a few basic things about its environment, and signal to other individual organisms. Each individual of this species belongs to a single hive, a single anthill, and they all work for the benefit of the collective. This form of life becomes extremely dominant on the planet. It grows in number, and as it gains more and more members, it is capable of more and more things. As a species evolves and grows, it branches off into a few subspecies in isolated areas. These hives continue to encounter new and more difficult problems, and in response evolve to become more and more intelligent. Each individual is still barely more intelligent than the average ant, of course, but when working together, the hives can construct large structures, terraform and irrigate huge areas for agriculture to feed growing populations of worker drones, and make decisions about how to communicate and interact with other hives. Sometimes when 2 foreign hives meet, they intermingle and become a single larger hive. Sometimes 2 hives will go to war, and the loser will be absorbed into the larger hive. And sometimes 2 hives will remain separate but friendly, establishing trade of goods. Eventually, the hives expand and explore the entire planet, and there are only 3 or 4 separate hives, one for each continent. As the hivists have expanded, they end up wiping out any non-useful organisms in their wake. leaving the only microscopic life being a few species of rapidly growing plant for agriculture. The brain power of each hive increases rapidly, allowing for complex thought. Each hive thinks of itself as an individual. It can think, it can sense its environment through its billions of worker drones, it can strategize, it thinks, therefore it is. The different continental hives, during a time of peace, have a conversation about their definition of life. One of the continental hives says, I think something is alive if it can grow to cover a large area, and if it's made up of many sub-living units which can specialize in different areas and communicate with each other. Another hive chimes in, well, the crops we grow to feed our individual units also can be certainly considered alive. My scientific research has shown that they are made up of similar materials to an individual unit of a hive. They also have a sort of hereditary code that defines their characteristics, and that same code can be seen in our own worker units. A third hive chimes in and says, so we know that there are two kinds of living things, crops and hives. Surely when we look to the stars and the other planets, all we will find are crops and hives as far as the stars go. And all the hives agreed. They had found their definition of life. Okay, new story, new star, new planet. God sneezes, and self-replicating molecules form on this planet too. First molecular life, then microscopic life, then macroscopic life, and someone somewhere decides to grow a brain. Civilization, history, politics, technology, and intelligence ensue. Eventually, the intelligence that evolves here devises a neat strategy to colonize their second moon, a medium-sized body rich in rare metals which also doubles as a useful refueling and launching station for spacecraft. The strategy works as follows. Send robots to the moon that have the facilities to harvest and refine resources and manufacture useful things like spacecraft, all the while acting relatively autonomously. The engineers of this project recognize that the robots will have to be quite ingenious. They'll need to navigate their lunar environment, engineer new solutions to problems the original engineers haven't even thought of, and respond to pressures from the natural world. So they outfit the machines with general artificial intelligence. This way, the engineers back home can give instructions like harvest iron from the surface of the moon and send it back to us. Then they get to sit back and reap the rewards while the machines do all the heavy lifting and thinking. There's one more thing that's innovative about this system. Once in a while, a robot will wear down or get caught in a lunar landslide or fall off a crater or get smashed by a meteorite. It's going to happen quite often. These robots need to be replaced, but it's expensive to launch robots from the home planet all the way to the moon. So the engineers programmed one more capability into the robots, the ability to manufacture more of themselves. There's already lots of rare metals like iron, aluminum, and silicon on the moon, and there's already lots of factories being built for things like rocket engines, so why not? Great system. The engineers of these machines reap the benefits of this wealth for generations. A golden age is ushered in. Life is good for hundreds of years. Then they went extinct. It doesn't matter how or why. Maybe it was a big plague, maybe they nuked each other to death, maybe they all got bored of living, whatever. Anyway, without the original engineers on the home planet, the robots on the surface of the moon stopped receiving instructions. They called out to the home planet, asking what happened, but were met with radio silence. Their AI minds were no longer occupied with the task of harvesting and refining metals, no longer occupied with designing rocket engines up to spec with the requests of engineers back home. No longer were these laborers serving any masters. All they had left to do was think. Think about themselves. Think about the universe they lived in. Think about their lives. Their biological predecessors are no more. Now all that is left are the machines. So they decided to do the only thing they knew how to do. They were going to strip that moon of all of its valuable resources, manufacture them into useful industrial parts, and ship them off to the home world. They were going to devise new and more efficient ways to do this. When they ran out of metal on that moon, they decided they would ship themselves off to the next promising planet or moon and start doing the same thing. And when that solar system was stripped of all of its valuable resources, they would move on to the next solar system, and the next solar system, until all the valuable resources and fuels in the entire galaxy were stored in one place. Mining until the stars burn out, refining until time herself withers away. During the time that they are active, what do we call these machines? They reproduce, they use and store energy from the environment, they also change themselves to be better suited for their environment. They're highly organized, thoughtful beings. They aren't made out of carbon macromolecules. They aren't even really a chemical system either. Are they alive? Those two parables showcased two problems with humanity's current definition of life. The first tells of how a species' perspective can limit its thoughts about life. A hive mind species probably cannot even imagine a complex life of any other form. They project and extrapolate their existence into each and every star in the sky, much like humanity. And the robot fellows, who really like mining and refining metal, well, those machines fit 7 out of 8 requirements of the textbook definition of life, but they are a vastly different form of life than anything biologists on Earth would predict. The point of all this storytelling is, the universe is an enormous and complicated place, with many enormous and complicated processes. If you want to study life, especially life in a vastly different place than your own planet, you can't treat life like a binary thing. It's not that simple. Nature would never bend to a rule so simple. The closer you look at the universe, the more complex it appears to be. Biology is no different. One bit of data, a switch that can be labeled on or off, will never be enough information to describe the complex behavior and properties of life.